How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew. This is Lemora's Cards, and today we're talking about the biggest change to cEDH in its history, I think, maybe since Flash Ban. This is probably bigger. That is the September 2024 quarterly update that we just got from the Commander Rules Committee, which has just completely shaken the entire format. I'm rushing to try to get a video recording my initial thoughts. If I look kind of goofy, my hair and my beard look wrong, I had to hurry. I just got home from the gym. It's a big rush. Nobody expected this. This is an insane bombshell. I'm still figuring out what I think about it. We're going to be talking about the banning of these 4 pretty impactful cards on our format, what it might mean, what I think about the ban list, any general thoughts. This is going to be fairly unedited. I like to get this up pretty quickly, so I'm just going to kind of rattle through the changes, what I think, where we're at right now. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below what you think about these changes. I think with all that being said, let's go ahead and hop into it. The September 2024 quarterly update just dropped with these 4 cards being banned: Dockside Extortionist, Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, and Nadu Winged Wisdom. I think because their descriptions are relatively short, we're going to talk about their reasoning first. I'm going to touch on what I think in terms of how this really applies to like Commander play in general and their thoughts on it. My thoughts are not entirely negative. In terms of cEDH, I think I'm leaning negative, but we'll see. I'm going to actually read through what they said though. Mana Crypt. Coming down for no mana on turn 1, it's quite possible to have the explosive start of Mana Crypt into a Signet or Talisman land in another Signet, leaving that player untapping 5 mana on turn 2. In games going 12 plus turns, the accumulated threat of damage from Mana Crypt provides a reasonable counterbalance for its explosive effect, but when you are snowballing to a turn 6 to 8 win, it's a meaningless drawback. Jeweled Lotus. Another card that can give you 5 mana on turn 2. Jeweled Lotus does it without even needing a good hand. I don't know about all that. Though you're restricted in what you can do with the mana, 4 and 5 mana commanders can pack a significant punch nowadays, often draw cards to make up for the one-shot mana, and offensive abilities such as Ward can't be interacted with that early in the game. Dockside Extortionist. Dockside isn't normally quite as explosive in the early game as the other 2 cards, but it can still go mana positive on turn 2 and start generating substantial treasures after that. Been on the border for years, and we've shied away from taking action in the past because the card has scaled well with the power level of the table, but it's a frequent contributor to the more egregious snowballing starts. They go on to mention that they're not going to be banning Soul Ring. They think based on the criteria, it is bannable. I agree. They're basically just saying like, this is part of the format, get over it. Probably could have said that with some of the other cards too, but whatever. And they talk a little bit more about Nadu, but they basically mentioned that Nadu is problematic. Part of the problem is the way it wins, where it takes a really long time to do non-deterministic sequences that can't be shortcut and might eventually fizzle out. These aren't dedicated combo lines that you have to build a deck around. Dropping Nadu into a normal Simic shell still runs the risk of grinding the game down to a slog of resource accrual. It interacts badly with cards that are staples of casual play, most notably Lightning Greaves, meaning that decks where it gets thrown into without abuse intent can still create a situation where the player is monopolizing all the time in the game. That's not an experience we want to risk. Nadu gets itself another ban. I think these bans actually are very smart for the greater casual play experience. I think for a long time, and I've talked about this, that the Rules Committee has had a philosophy they don't really actually show that they believe in. They talk about resource imbalances, and they haven't seemed to have made changes that actually fit the gameplay they describe that they want. And I think this is actually a push in that direction. These are some of the biggest sources of imbalanced resources that you can get. They lead to games that are just too explosive for the rest of the pod to deal with. These are like chase cards that are becoming very popular, or have been very popular for a long time at this point. And they have just moved their way into casual play to a point where it probably is just a negative for a lot of that play experience. And if you want to tame it, bring it down a little bit, these cards make sense. I think you could also apply that to Ristic Study and arguably Smothering Tithe. I think had this change had those cards and then maybe Orcish Bowmaster, so this would actually be just like a slam dunk for a lot of casual play, and really just keeping that environment a lot healthier and more balanced and have some better play patterns. But we're not going to talk too much about casual. I did want to talk about how there's different ways to approach a ban list, and I mentioned before that they approach it for the greater casual pick up and play experience. And these are cards that you kind of do want banned for that. You don't want to say like, yeah, my deck's a power level 5 and, I just threw Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus in there. It's pretty big different, it's a pretty big experience when you can potentially cast like a 6 mana commander turn 1. Those are the changes. Now, what do I think about them? I have mentioned before that Dockside Extortionist is the most impactful ban that you could have in this format. I think the only thing else that comes close is probably fetch lands. I don't even think Underworld Breach or Thassa's Oracle change that much. I guess if you hit both of them at once. This one's pretty huge. I think we should save it for last. So, Jeweled Lotus. Jeweled Lotus is definitely a power down of the format in general. This kind of the same can be said with Mana Crypt. Jeweled Lotus is only slightly more specific. Still, most decks in the format play it, but you have double pip commanders or the Rograk decks, Rasios decks, etc. They don't always play it, like Rog Thras, Timid Thras, Rogsai, Kinnan, decks like that don't play these cards. But this is still a huge hit, especially to those like 2 in a red, 2 in a blue, 2 in a white, whatever commanders. The Sisseys, Nagilas, Malcolms, anything like that. And then also the really pip intensive or expensive commanders that Jeweled Lotus was kind of a nice bonus to actually justify you being able to play those cards. Like the Niv Mizzets, you could even put like Tivit, Atraxa into that sort of camp that now lost this tool to help power them out and make them a little bit more playable. I think those cards did have an effect, especially Jeweled Lotus, where they like really powered up cheaper commanders almost even more than expensive commanders. And they especially empowered cards like Fierce Guardianship and Deflecting Swat to ridiculous levels where there's a level of consistency with them between Soul Ring, Crypt, all your fast mana J-Lo to power out a Sisay, Gila, whatever. And have those cards online a really unrealistic, like a really unreasonable amount of the time. I don't think Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt are the worst bans here. They are just kind of like saying, hey, the power level of this format is not where we want it. We're bringing it down. A lot of people did like that about cEDH. They love the power level. If you did like that, yeah, it's bad. Mana Crypt specifically is just the most generic good card of the format. You're going to play the card in your deck, even if you're a collector oof deck, Null Rod, whatever. You know what? Mana Crypt helps you cast those spells. It didn't necessarily prop up any decks. You could argue that Turbo takes a little bit of a hit with Mana Crypt, but then also like what was the best mid-range start in the game? Crypt, Land, Rhystic Study, right? So I don't know that this hits any deck in particular, but it certainly does depower our format, which is completely subjective, whether you like that or not. A lot of people love the draw of this is, you know, a broken format. This is vintage light. And now it's less of that. We one less, you know, vintage only card is now in our format. So, yeah, it's different. We're a little bit weaker. It's a little bit harder to cast those Nauses or those early Chroms and stuff like that without your J-Lo and your Mana Crypt. I think the J-Lo ban, I like a little bit less. It's really hard to say, but they're both fairly ubiquitous and I think are the least offensive here and will have the least shakeups that we can at least see in terms of deck construction. I have heard some talks about like Mox Opal maybe a little bit worse now. That might be true too, especially with the other card we're going to talk about being banned. Nadu Winged Wisdom is banned. So the reason that they described for banning Nadu doesn't really save it from the just do banned as commander thing, because man, I would love it if Nadu was just banned as commander and we could still play it in like the TNT, Kenrith, whatever decks that, you know, especially like some of those decks that just lost the creature that they get to build their deck around. Would be nice to have a different option, but now both of the creatures that decks were built around have been banned from the format. There's not really a secret commander or whatever build around creature in the deck at all anymore, which I think is a pretty big loss. I was pretty happy about Nadu's impact on the format. I know Nadu, especially as a deck, led to some sort of frustrations. People didn't really like it. It does have, you know, the problematic stuff that it does in casual does apply here as well. It is unfortunate to see something that people had really gravitated towards though, and really had a lot of passion for disappear already. I think this one, more so than some of the other decks we're going to talk about later, had the writing on the wall a little bit, and it wasn't out that long. So it's like, it's a little bit less of a hit, but I still do think this is a hit. And we had talked about on the podcast, we thought Nadu would probably get banned eventually. So it's a little hard to get too upset about this one, but I do think it is kind of lame that the format is losing one of its staple decks on top of also losing one of the more interesting build arounds, especially in your 98 or 99 that did have a real deck building cost. Like if I'm choosing to run things like Umbral Mantle or Nomad Core or whatever that are dead cards that don't even work with my commander, they work with this other creature I have to find. I thought that was a really nice dynamic that tended to work on a value axis too, not necessarily pure combo, though, you know, it can lean into that very quickly, especially in the white Nadu decks. But I did really like the creativity that we were seeing with that. And it is kind of sad to see Nadu go so quickly, but it does make sense to get it now before people, you know, build their whole identity and, you know, their play style and everything they love about the format around this deck. Because when you do that and then you ban the deck, you know, or you ban a card that people had built their entire Magic existence was built around. There are people who only play cEDH for years, maybe 5 whole years, and they've, you know, played decks that take advantage of cards like Dockside Extortionist. And this is the only format they play, and it's the only deck they play. And after 5 years of saying, we're probably, you know, Dockside we think is fine, suddenly banning it and removing a lot of people's favorite decks from the format, arguably, at least removing them from viability or what they're intended to do, really their their whole game plan. That's pretty bad. I think Dockside was a really tough ban here. I think this is going to impact the format a lot more than some people expect. I think a lot of people realize that this card held up a ton of the format. So much of the format was built on this one card, and it's really hard to accurately describe just how much this is going to shake up the format. This was a card that was able to punish really greedy playstyles. It was a card that a lot of decks entirely built around. Many infinite mana combo decks were built around Dockside Extortionist as their win con. People really dislike Thassa's Oracle. Well, the only other playable win con in the format is gone. Most of the infinite mana stuff kind of sucks now, at least comparison to Dockside combos. And so a lot of that isn't going to be a thing anymore. And I do think that's probably a negative. I don't want to get too upset and say that like the whole format is ruined, cEDH is dead, but it is going to be incredibly different. The big thing for me as somebody who's kind of forward-facing figure in the community that gets a lot of just talk thrown at me of people talk about what they love about the format, what they're feeling about the format. Just this, if you like the hour or two or whatever that this announcement has been live, I've gotten so many messages of people who are like, my deck is banned. I played Corvold, I played Kinrith, I played whatever, Omnath, Rogthras, all these different decks that are built around it. That was my deck and this was my format. And now doesn't seem like my deck is going to be playable. And, I built it around this thing that had been, it's one thing if you built your deck around Nadu, right? One, that's pretty new, and you shouldn't necessarily expect a problematic card that is fairly new to necessarily stay in the format. When you build it around a card that's been legal for 5 years and that hasn't really changed, nothing about the card, there's no new real, especially breaking combo, especially that's leaning its way into casual, right? It's not like Chthonian Nightmare broke Dockside Extortionist. There is a little bit of an expectation, especially with like the philosophy of Commander, that this is a very stable format where you can buy your cards and expect that things aren't likely to change dramatically. New things will come in and get addressed, very rarely, but they will be, or they'll at least be talked about. And even some of those things that were talked about on the radar, unlike some of these cards which haven't been brought up as recently, like Orcish Bowmasters, or I guess Mirkwood Bats, but I think they realized that one was kind of a joke. Didn't get addressed here. I'm not sure about that, but I know Dockside was a frustrating card for a lot of decks to deal with, and a lot of players didn't like seeing it in the format. But I would ask that you don't just because you're not a red player, that you don't try to dunk on these people who built their entire, cEDH experience. Like this hobby for them was a deck that Dockside Extortionist enabled. There's a lot of people like that. Some people aren't going to have the feeling that I have of that every time any player is lost or leaves the format, it's like a huge negative. That's been the big thing for me from the beginning, is that I want people to be able to get in easily and that we don't lose players before they even start. And I want to keep players and have them enjoy the format and, stay here forever. And it does really suck when you have that perspective to have people like, oh, I play Kinnan, my deck's finally playable, suck it, red players. Like, no one cares. Read the room a little bit. It's not always about you. I know people who do that think everything's about them, but read the room. And it really sucks to get messages of people who are like, I think I'm going to be done with the format. Is there a deck I can play that feels like this? I don't know that there is, because people form their identity around their commanders. And when it feels like your commander is banned, yeah, what are you playing for anymore? It does really suck. I'm going to do a deeper dive in future content about what the impact I think of these bans will be. But I do want to quickly go over the current best performing decks or most popular decks and talk about which decks just got hit the most, just kind of briefly. So we're looking at the most popular decks. Now I'm going to sort by top 16, so I don't think that's as relevant. I want to really look at what is getting the most play right now. This is looking at post July, which is what our next quarterly update will be looking at. Timnachrom, Lost Mana Crypt, and Jeweled Lotus. For the most part, not the biggest shakeup for them. I think a lot of people are talking about how that and Dockside are the most untouched. Dockside, Lost Mana Crypt, some of the best turbo starts are now, not there, but overall, the deck didn't lose anything kind of foundational to what it does. To say is known as Dockside, the deck. This deck will probably still be playable, but it lost its ability to very quickly win. A lot of the best synergies it has with its Planeswalker build was taking advantage of Dockside and flickering it and whatever. So this deck is absolutely taking a pretty huge hit. I do expect it'll still be playable with Bloom Tinder, Faber Elder stuff that you can do, but it's going to require some retooling and is going to be pretty different and significantly weakened. Nadu is no longer a deck in this format. So a deck that has in less in less than 3 months become the 4th most popular deck in the format, is no longer legal. That's gone. Kinnan doesn't really get any changes. It might benefit from some of these bans to an extent. It kind of depends on how the meta shakes out. Kenrith lost. This is basically a Dockside combo deck. There are other things they can do. Kenrith was already not doing especially well. It has some really diehard players, but not really the most popular. Wasn't a Jeweled Lotus deck, so it doesn't really care about that. But Dockside ban is pretty huge. They were a Chthonian Nightmare, Image, Reanimate, Skirk, Prospector. Like, that was the deck. So Kenrith taking a massive hit. Not sure how it's going to recover. Najeela, another deck that hasn't been doing especially well. Losing Jeweled Lotus and Crypt, meaning early Najeelas are much less likely to be on. Big hit, but that does hit a lot of other commanders. Some Najeela decks were doing Chthonian Nightmare Dockside, so that's another thing that they just lost. Again, Najeela was already trending downward. Maybe mid-rangey Najeelas could end up having a bit of a comeback here, but it definitely lost some of its better cards. Tivit losing Crypt and Jeweled Lotus, that was a big thing I talked about with more expensive commanders. They lost that. Casting your 6-drop commander is way less feasible. That means building around a 6-drop commander is a lot less, kind of pushed. Like, you have less incentive to try to do that in the format. You're really not encouraged to do it at this point. Rogthras was one of the better Dockside combo decks, it being empowered by its ability to combo in a lot of different ways with Dockside, but specifically like it being the best Cloudstone Curio Dockside combo deck. That's a pretty huge blow to this deck. The Dockside combos were some of the strongest stuff they could do. They still do have access to Kinnan Basalt, Cloud of Fairies with Cloudstone Curio, stuff like that. They still have access to different combos. It's a pretty big change. Magda was also a deck that, kind of like Sisay, doesn't necessarily have to resolve Dockside, but its ability to know that it can resolve Dockside and that means it wins the game was a huge thing, propping up a very interesting mono red deck that is probably going to take a fairly big hit here. Wasn't really the biggest Jeweled Lotus or Mana Crypt list. Does take a hit there. Another thing I will mention, a lot of the Kenriths and even Rogthrases to an extent, but mainly Kenriths had become Secret Commander Nadu decks or were using Nadu as an engine that they could build the deck around. Also losing that as well. So 2 big hits for them. Korvold was a Dockside deck. It was the Dockside deck. When people think of Dockside in cEDH and like, what is a Dockside deck? It's like Korvold, Magda, Sisay. Korvold was already not doing especially well, and it just lost the thing that is its identity. It's pretty massive. Yuriko not losing much. Obnix losing. Jeweled Lotus is actually pretty big. Atraxa losing that. As we go down the list, we'll see more and more. But a lot of the most popular decks got pretty big hits, if not to their viability in terms of just like the potential that they have in the early game with the fast mana. Major structural parts of what makes them function as a deck being straight up gone with the removal of Nadu and especially Dockside Extortionist. So, initial thoughts a lot of people have is that lower decks are going to do better. I'm not really sure. I do think Rockside and TNK, which were already kind of looking like the 2 best decks in the format, are actually better here. I think in terms of competitive viability, there's a couple things that could happen where either those 2 decks just continue to be incredibly dominant forces, because I think those decks more than some of the others like Sisay and Nadu were what was pushing things down out of viability. And I think removing a lot of those like tier 2 kind of options, like the Rogthras, Kenrith, Korvold being tier 2, tier 3, whatever, a lot of those being less good now. I feel like the format is going to be more homogenous, but it's not going to be as built around one singular card in terms of Dockside Extortionist. But if your deck didn't need that and you were already really, really busted, probably going to still be busted, but we'll see. We're going to talk more about that, probably do a podcast episode on it. Let me know what your thoughts are and what you would like to hear. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.